The culinary world was shook to its core when it announced on June 8, 2018, that celebrity chef Anthony Bourdain passed away at age 61. As we mourn for the loss of America's favorite bad boy chef, here are some parts of his story you may not know. When the contents of Bourdain's will were made public, it came with a surprise. Even though estimates put his net worth at somewhere around $16 million, his will totaled only $1.2 million. The difference may just come down to sensible inheritance planning, with Variety reporting that Bourdain had also placed assets in a trust, which doesn't have to be disclosed publicly. However, the chef himself once told Wealth Simple, "Reports of my net worth are about 10 times overstated. I think the people who calculate these things assume that I live a lot more sensibly than I do." When Vanity Fair interviewed some of the fixers that accompanied Bourdain on all of his trips, they said he was only able to open a savings account when he was 44 years old, and that his whole team often stayed in very undesirable hotels. When Vanity Fair interviewed Bourdain's fixers, they agreed that as he got more and more popular and started to be recognized, something was changing. By the time he moved to CNN, those who worked with him could see that the increasing fame and the rush to get the camera shots needed for the show, instead of spending time getting to know the people behind the food, were making him miserable. One fixer said he no longer went out at night with the crew, that he opted for room service alone, and that the final bright light was the Hong Kong episode, directed by his girlfriend, Asia Argento. There, they say, he was happy. After Bourdain's passing, news outlets and social media weren't just mourning the loss of one of television's most down-to-earth stars, they were also pointing fingers and trying to get to the bottom of why he chose to take his life. According to CBS News, one of those targeted as the answer to that question was Argento. Just days before Bourdain's death, photos were taken of Argento with another man, and conclusions were drawn. When she spoke out against the accusations, though, she didn't deny she had been cheating, but just expressed that outside observers can never truly know what goes on between two people.
He had cheated on me too. It wasn't a problem with us.
Argento seemed to be saying the two had an understanding, adding that he traveled 265 days a year.
When we saw each other, we took really great pleasure in each other's presence, but we are not children.
In 2018, the media started reporting on a strange saga unfolding around Argento. Argento, who was a massive advocate for the Me Too movement, had reportedly agreed to pay actor and former co-star Jimmy Bennett $380,000 not to press charges for assaulting him as a minor. According to The Cut, Argento claimed she hadn't been the one to buy his silence. It was Bourdain. The whole thing is incredibly complicated and centers around an incident that allegedly happened in 2013 when Bennett was 17 years old. Exactly what happened isn't clear, but what doesn't seem to be up for debate is that Bourdain had already paid Bennett $250,000. Everyone who saw Bourdain on television or heard him speak formed a very clear picture of him. He was a well-spoken man who was able to find those things that would allow him to connect with anyone, anywhere. But several months after his death, GQ talked to some of the people who had known him best, and they painted a very different picture of who he actually was. Chris Collins, the TV producer that worked with Bourdain to develop No Reservations and Parts Unknown, said that his on-screen persona was nothing like the real person. Their first outing to Japan was apparently a nightmare, and Bourdain was extremely shy. As Collins described, Bourdain did not engage with us. He would not acknowledge our presence. Apparently, that only changed in Vietnam, where he found a, quote, instant cultural touchstone that brought him out of his shell.
So, back in Vietnam, one of my favorite places on earth, and all of the things I need for happiness.
It was his 2000 memoir, Kitchen Confidential, that put him on the map, but he had already released a number of books of a very different sort, crime fiction. He started with 1995's A Bone in the Throat, which has his main character, a chef, unsurprisingly, getting mixed up in Little Italy's criminal underworld. It was later made into a film starring Gossip Girl's Ed Westwick. That was followed by 1997's Gone Bamboo, and later by 2001's The Bobby Gold Stories. Bourdain explained the storytelling allure of the criminal world to the New York Times. Crime as work appeals to me, the guy who gets up in the morning and makes his living by crime. I've always been a crime buff and a big fan of crime jargon, and in the restaurant business, I've met a bunch of gangsters. Karen Berger, editor and founder of DC Comics' Vertigo imprint, worked with Bourdain on his 2012 graphic novel, Get Jiro. She told Vulture that Bourdain was a massive fan of dark, underground comics and graphic novels. He followed up Get Jiro with 2018's Hungry Ghosts, a 4-part comic book series for Dark Horse. As far back as the 1970s, Bourdain had tried his hand at both writing and illustrating graphic novels. But the publishers he approached told him he just wasn't good enough as an artist. Bourdain recruited illustrators and a co-writer to finally bring his visions to life. Bourdain traveled the globe in search of great food and compelling stories, but there's one place he's always had a tongue-in-cheek aversion to, and it's a bit surprising: Switzerland. Back in 2008, he wrote on his Travel Channel blog, "Even Ricola commercials make me break into a cold sweat. Lederhosen, alpine hats, cuckoo clocks, St. Bernards, cross-country skiers, and the sound of music make me physically ill." He later told Conan O'Brien he had a morbid fear of all things Swiss, but wasn't quite sure why.
I must have had some terrible childhood experience while watching Sound of Music that I blocked out.
Bourdain's second wife, MMA fighter Ottavia Busia, wrote a piece for Vice describing just how important MMA and UFC was to the family. According to her, Bourdain was a big boxing fan back in the 1970s, and once she took him to an MMA fight, he really got into it. She went on to interview him on the subject, and he said that he loved that she fought and could always defend herself. But she had to ban him from watching her compete because he made her anxious. Bourdain said he didn't want her to ever experience the agony of defeat, considering how hard she works to prepare for her fights. He also said he was glad his daughter was also learning how to defend herself.
The day will come when little Timmy in the next desk is going to pull her hair. And I like the idea that she'll be able to f little Timmy up real bad.
Bourdain had a love of all things handcrafted and focused on unsung artisans in his web series Raw Craft, a paid promotional partnership with Scottish whiskey brand The Balvenie. When Bourdain made himself available for an Ask Me Anything session on Reddit, someone asked him if he got to keep the, quote, samurai-quality knife artisan Bob Kramer made in an episode of Raw Craft. He said he didn't, but he later bid on it when it went to auction. It ended up selling for around $22,000. After waiting more than a year, Bourdain finally purchased a Kramer blade, and he was thrilled, writing, "It is easily my most valued physical object that I own. It is a thing of beauty, and I'm just waiting to find food worthy of it to use it." When news of Bourdain's death broke, there was an immediate outpouring of grief. It wasn't just foodies and chefs who mourned his passing. As NPR notes, there were particularly moving tributes from those in communities widely marginalized by the rest of society. Food historian Michael W. Twitty wrote on Twitter, "For a black man that has walked the plank for being highly critical of the food world so white, Anthony Bourdain was special. He called Africa the cradle of civilization, took his cameras to Haiti, honored the hood with Snoop, broke bread with Obama like a human being." University of Detroit law professor Khalid Badoun lauded Bourdain for, quote, humanizing Muslims and Arabs as regular, everyday people, without politicizing their lives or stories. Journalist Mohammed Al-Safin tweeted, "If you're from a marginalized, dehumanized community, you know what Anthony Bourdain meant. To Palestinians, Iranians, Libyans, undocumented immigrants in the U.S., abused women. What a loss."
It's no secret that substance abuse runs rampant in the food service industry. Bourdain developed a serious problem with drugs while working in kitchens many years ago. Most significantly, he developed a heroin addiction, which he managed to kick in the 80s.
I wanted to become a heroin addict. I was very proud of myself when I first shot up. I was a vulnerable, goofy, awkward guy whose only success socially was to be the baddest guy in the room.
He also smoked crack cocaine. On a Reddit AMA, he wrote that he found himself combing the shag carpet for paint chips in the hope that they were fallen crack bits, and smoking them anyway. He quit that too. Bourdain came from relatively humble origins in New Jersey, where he was raised on standard American cuisine, but he was intrigued by the smells that would drift upstairs when the adults were hosting dinner parties downstairs. And when his family traveled abroad, his curiosity only grew. He told The Guardian that he responded to being left out of adult dinners by his parents with a culinary rebellion of sorts, recalling, "I reacted by requesting oysters and dishes they found repulsive and becoming increasingly adventurous in my tastes. It wasn't about the food, but about getting a reaction." He told Conan that even he has limits.
I've eaten a lot of really nasty things on my show, but nothing as soul-destroying as my airport Johnny Rockets experience.
Bourdain cut his teeth in the restaurant business as a dishwasher, and he actually liked the job. At the time, he was a self-professed awkward teenager, and as he told The Guardian, this job made total objective sense to him. The ability to perform the job well, accomplishing any task given to him within the job description, allowed him to flourish under the tutelage of people he respected and admired. He told Fresh Air,
I was a happy dishwasher. I jokingly say that I learned every important lesson, all the most important lessons of my life as a dishwasher.
Bourdain did do a bit of traveling before he became a famous globetrotting chef, so what was it that made him want to do more in life and see more of the world?
The first time I came here, it was just like taking acid for the first time.
Bourdain told Men's Journal that a trip to Japan, shortly before Kitchen Confidential was published, completely changed his life. He said, "It showed me there was so much more in the world than I had any idea about. There was so much to learn and there was so much stuff out there." It's hard to look at Bourdain and imagine him struggling to pay his bills, but he spent years busting his hump in the kitchen, worrying if he'd be able to get by. He told Biography that at age 44, he was standing in kitchens, not knowing what it was like to go to sleep without being in mortal terror. "I was in horrible, endless, irrevocable debt. I had no health insurance, I didn't pay my taxes, I couldn't pay my rent." But things changed for Bourdain when his first book, Kitchen Confidential, was published, catapulting him out of the world of kitchen obscurity and into the world of celebrity. The book, which was credited with revolutionizing the entire genre of food writing, was so well received that he no longer had to slave in a kitchen for 12 or more hours every day, he told Fresh Air.
When the book came out, it very quickly transformed my life. I mean, changed everything.